You know, something there's never a shortage of on the road, especially when you're full-timing, is a routine maintenance. So today I'm going to take you along. It's going to be kind of cool. I'm going to take you along in the first person. So I'm going to change the oil and fuel filters, going to check out the air filter, and kind of give you a brief tour of our particular generator, the Onan 5500 Marquis Gold. It's pretty common in a lot of RVs.
I'm Shauna, and this is Brian. Welcome to our channel, Life Uninterrupted.
In 2018, we sold our home, auctioned off most of our belongings, and bought a motorhome, which we affectionately refer to as Frida.
We travel full-time with our two French bulldogs, Lucy and Ricky.
Join us on our adventures by subscribing and hitting the bell icon so that you're notified when our videos release each week. This is the front access or side access door for the generator. And one thing you always want to make sure is that this is always intact and properly put in place while you're running the generator. Never leave this door, never take the door off when you're operating the generator, because this provides basically a seal for this compartment and allows the generator to cool as needed. This oil change is going to be pretty straightforward. It takes 2 quarts of oil. I do use pretty good high quality motor oil. I use a Royal Purple. This is an SAE 30 oil that I use, and even Onan recommends SAE 30 because it definitely helps control oil consumption. All of these generators do consume some amount of oil. SAE 30 weight lessens that oil consumption, so it's really good for that, and it's also good for air-cooled engines, which is what these generators are, generally speaking, unless you have a different sort of coach or RV that provides water cooling. In this case, it's not, just air-cooled. So I do use that. Okay, on the service information panel here, it'll give you all the information you need. So generally, I change the oil every year, or at about 150 hours. Now, we've had this coach for 3 years. I've only changed the oil 3 times because we only use it about 100 hours or less per year, but I do keep it changed at least annually, regardless of how many hours I put on the coach, so you can have all that information. And this is particular to our generator. Yours may be different, so check out your service information placard or your generator maintenance manual. It will tell you all you need to know. Now, I do use, as I said earlier, 30 weight oil, so it is specified here, and it specifies 32 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. We very seldom get in temperatures below 32, so the SAE 30 is going to work well. As I said earlier, it does take 2 quarts with the oil filter. And speaking of oil filter, you can use the oil filters that are specified on the service information panel. It does give you Onan's part numbers. Those are usually kind of hard to find and just about twice as expensive as other oil filters. So I do use Wix filters. Wix filters are pretty good, very high quality. So for our particular generator, this is the Wix part number 57398. And it's just your typical screw-on filter with gasket. I do pre-fill this when I change the oil so that you don't have a dry startup. So very important to do. And also, when I take the filter off, which is located right here, you can kind of see the white edge of it. It has to come off from underneath down here, unscrew it, and then it drops out. So that does get a little bit messy. But when you do pull this off, you always want to make sure that the O-ring comes with it, so that you get a good seal on the new filter when you install it. All right, in the opening, I did mention I'm going to change fuel filters. I do change those at the same time every year that I change the oil. There's one filter right here, and there's another filter down here underneath connected to the fuel pump. Now, I'm not going to show changing that on camera because it is a little messy. As you can imagine, the fuel is going to drain out and kind of get everywhere, so I'm not going to show that one. This one's not quite as bad. This filter housing will have to come off, so let's take a look at that. So this is the cover for the filter housing. Here's the filter. Again, this gets changed depending on usage. This could probably use a change, although it's not too bad. I'll probably run it a little bit longer. But this part of the filter housing will need to come off. 2 bolts here and 2 nuts here. This lifts out of the way, and then you can get access to this fuel filter. if not, there's really no way you can get this fuel filter tight enough to keep it from leaking. I've had that issue, so I've had to take this off and tighten it back up every now and then. So if you come out one day and you smell fuel and you pull the cover of your generator off and you see fuel dripping down here or somewhere in here, then you know that most likely this is your culprit. Onan has supplied a shut-off valve for the oil drain right here, and there's also a black hose that's connected here to it. I'll pull it off and show you that. So that's the drain hose. What I do, I go at the extra, or add an extra length of hose to this, and what that does is it allows me to drain that into my oil catch can much more easily. So I'll just install that back, connect that back to the oil drain port. And then here is what I use. I just use a 10 quart. I use this to change the oil in the coach and everything. So I kind of set it up like this, up on its end. And then I'll put the other end of this hose in there. Now normally I would start up the generator for a few minutes to warm it up. Unfortunately, this RV resort has a strict policy on using generators, and that is none whatsoever, so I can't do that. What I will do though is I always take this off. This kind of helps drain the oil a little bit, and then I'll just crack this. And I like using this section of clear tubing because it lets me know what's happening with the oil, whether it's not draining out or if it is in fact draining, and when it's done. So I'll do that, get that down in there nice and well. The stuff is sitting on these rocks, so it's a little hard to stand up straight. So that will continue to drain, and like I said, only 2 quarts of oil in this generator. So in the meantime, while that's draining, I'm going to get my tools. I'm going to take off this air filter housing, and that way I can gain access to the filter, so while the oil is draining I can get the filter changed, fuel filter changed, and be done with that. Pretty straightforward. Alright, with those 2 bolts and the 2 nuts here on the carburetor off, this just kind of will maneuver out of the way and comes off pretty easily like that. And as you can see, provides easy access to this filter. Now this is going to get a little bit messy. As I go, I go through and I just kind of wipe stuff up. Once you get that cover out of the way, you can get pretty easy access to stuff, so you can get an idea of if things are leaking or maybe something else you need to replace. All looks pretty good. I don't see any major issues there. It's probably time to adjust the valves on this too, but we'll do that at another time. Always make sure this gasket's back in place. You don't lose that. That's important. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do here, see, that was already loose. So over time, these things will loosen up, so you have to be careful of that. So I'll just get a pair of channel locks, undo that little clamp, be careful of your carburetor. Sometimes you got to work at these things a little bit. Get that hose loosened up. Might be a little fuel come out of that. I guess not this time. Just kind of tuck that away. And like I said, this was already loose. So we'll make sure the next one is on pretty tight. So the fuel filters that I use normally are wicks, and for my generators, the 33046. Couldn't get 2 of these in the local part stores, so I did go with a micro guard. It's Fram, same part number. So since I have two filters, and oh, by the way, Onan has since changed the design where they stopped requiring a secondary filter before it goes into the carburetor filter bowl. So they did put out basically it's a fitting with a connection like this for the hose to connect to. So it did away with the filter. Those are about $36. This was $4 for this filter, so I couldn't see spending $36 for that fitting when I could buy, quite a few of these for the same price, and it's no big deal to pull this off and change it. So there's the replacement filter. It simply gives into place pretty easily, like this. Now this can get a little tricky because you don't have a lot of room in here, as you can see. So it's going to be a little dicey to get this tightened. To go a little bit at a time. Can rotate that fitting up a little bit, up out of the way. To do that, just loosen it enough to allow the filter to swivel up. Alright, that's nice and snug, and then just rotate this back down to tighten it in place. And that's pretty much it. I think, I think I'm going to have to get a new gasket for that. Yeah, definitely. Well, looks like I'll have to do that after I do the oil change. So that's the one filter. We'll get everything put back together, and then it looks like the oil is just about drained, pretty close. You have the filter housing back on, and this is a good time to just take a cloth and clean out any funky stuff in there, especially around this seal area. This is where the filter actually seals against the housing. Just clean that out. Something I do as well is I'll just mix, this is not McGuire's, I just mix up some Dawn and water, and sometimes I'll just spray that lightly on stuff to help break down any grease or oil that's in that filter housing. But just give it a good wipe down and get all the major junk out of there before putting the filter back in. That definitely looks better. Okay. All right, then also on this filter itself, just clean that sealing surface of the filter off. Provides a little bit better surface to seal air out and gunk and all that stuff that wants to get into the carburetor. So clean it up really well. I probably will change this filter, although it does have some life on it, but I'll probably pick one up and go ahead and change that as well. I don't always buy one when I buy the filter oil and filter kit, but sometimes I find that you just don't need a new air filter. So just clean all this off really well. Get the cover, do the same thing. Any junk that's on that sealing surface off of there. It's pretty simple, just slips in there with 3 little tabs, push it in place, and button your 3 clips up. And that is all there is to changing that filter, fuel filter, and your air filter. Okay, so in the course of changing those filters, you can see here that there's no more oil coming out of the engine crankcase. So I'm going to close this drain valve. Close that off. Just snug it up. You don't need to really wrench on it. And then at the same time, I'll disconnect the clear plastic tube that I added. Put the black tube back in place. First time I used just this black drain tube coming off of the drain port. Yeah, it was pretty messy. Kind of went everywhere. So I learned by adding this simple piece of clear tube. And by the way, I use the same clear tubing on the valve when I change the engine oil. Alright, so just kind of clean this stuff up as you go. Alright, so that is all there is to draining the oil. Got this tube back in place, as I said a minute ago. Next is going to be changing the filter. You can kind of see the filter just right there, a little white part of it, and the rest of it is actually accessible down here. This is the bit of the messier part, so I imagine as I unscrew this I'll lose some oil and it'll splatter. But if you do it nice and slow and carefully and use a rag underneath it like this, it usually is not as messy. Sometimes you'll have to break this free depending on how long it's been on with some channel locks. I can spin it off with my hands, but I'm going to use channel locks to break it free a little easier. There we go. Sometimes I'll use a plastic bag, especially on the coach filter, the engine filter. I'll put a plastic bag up underneath the filter like this to catch any oil. There's not nearly as much oil in this filter as in the main engine filter. So just screw this off nice and slow. And then you can feel it come loose. And then just drop it down nice and easy out of that pocket. You can see it's quite full of oil, so just turn that upside down, let it drain into the catch basin, kind of move that out of the way. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier is I always want to make sure you can see this black O-ring that's on the old filter. You got to make sure that that comes off and that isn't stuck to the oil pump housing up there. So I just reach up in there. It's kind of a little bit difficult to get to. Just reach up in there and wipe it clean with your towel and get it prepped for the new filter. I just use a dab of the old oil and kind of just lubricate this filter a little bit, just enough, not a lot. And then I'll take my new oil, fresh oil, and I'll fill the filter. So the reason they call this Royal Purple, you may not be able to see it in camera, but it actually is purple. This is a full synthetic. You can use full synthetic or conventional or a mixture. It's entirely up to you. But just fill that filter up and just wait a few seconds. It'll kind of percolate down and fill all the cavities inside the filter, and you can see the oil inside the filter casing go down as it fills the cavities. So just keep doing that. Until you get to a point where it stops receding, the level stops dropping inside the filter. This is not a requirement. I just find that it treats the engine much better having oil in the filter so that you don't have a dry start right out of the gate. And just keep filling. It looks like that's pretty good. Okay, didn't take much, maybe a cup or so, cup and a half. Just put it back up through this opening underneath, and you'll feel it engage the threads of the pump. Spin it in place and just hand tighten. It's funny, hand tightening is subjective. This particular filter is hard to get a good grip, so I just take a pair of vice grips and I'll put a last little about a quarter turn on it to get it nice and snug. So that's all there is to changing that oil filter. Alright, so let's fill the crankcase with all the remaining oil, and as I said earlier, even on the service instructions here, it says oil and filter, oil capacity 2 quarts with filter. I find that it doesn't always take 2 quarts because I never fill my crankcase all the way up. I leave a little bit of room for expansion, so I'll usually go at most half, maybe a little bit less. But I do check the oil after, or before rather, every start. So that's also very important, because these will use oil. So make sure you check your oil level before you start your generator each and every start. Another thing that I really like about these Onans is that, you know, they engineered in a nice wide oil fill port. So if you're careful, you don't need a funnel. Just be careful and you won't make a mess. Alright, so that's the first quart. And as you fill the crankcase with oil, it'll go in pretty quick at first, but then as it starts to fill, it will slow a little bit, so you have to be careful not to continue to pour it really fast, or else it will back up and spill out. So with the first quart in, I'll take my dipstick and check just to make sure I know about how much more I need to add. So just tighten that down, loosen it up. Yeah, sure enough, way down here at the add mark. So I'll add some more oil. So I have just about half a quart in. Set that aside and I'll do another check. Sure, I'll need to add more. I like to check as I go. So at least we're out of the add portion. We're now into the safe zone, so I know I can continue to add more. It's also important to know that, you know, after you do this, you'll want to run the generator, one, to make sure oil is everywhere it needs to be, and two, to make sure that you have the proper oil level. As I said earlier, this particular park has a strict no generator policy, so I'm not going to be able to crank it up and do that. I'll be able to do that probably once we leave and get to our next spot, but I don't anticipate using the generator before then. But if I do, I'll definitely check oil level before I crank it up and add any load to it. So just continue to add oil slowly. At this point you need to add it very slowly because the sump is getting full and it does back up pretty quickly. So if you just go and dump a bunch of oil really quickly, you're just going to overflow massively and waste your oil. This Royal Purple is not that expensive. You know, oil prices these days is kind of crazy. So this is really only for a high grade synthetic oil. It's only a couple dollars more than you know, say a Mobil or Pennzoil or something like that. But I think it's worth it. This provides better performance for the engine, better cooling properties at this SAE 30 level, and better oil consumption properties. Alright, so that's about 3/4 of the quart. We'll do another check. So there we're just about halfway, and I have 1/4 of a quart left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the whole second quart, and once I check it, once I have the opportunity to fire it up and check it, if I need to drain any off, I can certainly do that. It's up to you how you want to do that. If you're in the same situation, you could add a little bit less, take it to the safety, maybe 3/4 of the safety. Maybe that's what I'll do instead of wasting the oil. I'll just take it to 3/4 of the safe zone, reserve some of the good fresh oil, crank it up when I can. If I need to add some oil, I will. That way I'm not wasting it. Even Royal Purple, where I buy mine at O'Reilly's, this is still it's less than $11 a quart, so not terrible for an ultra high performance oil. Especially in an engine like this, it only takes 2 quarts, not a huge deal. Alright, so let's check level again. And I'm just about 3/4 full, so I think I'm going to call that good. And once I fire it up, if I need to add oil, I'll do that. So get a cap on that so that if it falls over, it doesn't spill. Kind of like liquid gold. All right. So that is pretty much it for the oil change and filter change. As I said, the other filter, oil or fuel filter, is down here. I'll change that at a later date. As I mentioned earlier, I like to mix up some Dawn dish washing liquid with some water, and you know, as I finish up here the oil change, it's a good time to do some inspection too, just to check wiring, make sure everything's intact and tight, nothing's loose or frayed or burnt, you don't have any oil or fuel leaks anywhere. And you can just spray a little bit of this dishwashing liquid on lightly and just do a quick superficial clean of stuff. Doesn't have to be great. Remember, this is an air-cooled engine, so the more buildup and dirt you have on the engine and any of the cooling components, the less effective it is at cooling. So make sure you can get any of that junk off that you can, and keep the engine as clean as possible. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is that make sure you disconnect your power to this. I disconnected it at another connector, so I don't have any power running to it. And also, this has an auto generator start, so you want to disable that just in case if you forget to disable power, then the auto gen start doesn't sense that there's an issue with, you know, coach power and try to start up the generator on you when, one, you're either draining oil, or two, you have filter out, or, you know, the oil port open, because yeah, that would not be good. So just be cognizant of that. Other than that, this looks pretty good. Hey, leave me any questions or comments you have about this particular generator. I'll certainly try to answer those. And if you have questions about your generator or particular preventative maintenance or routine maintenance you do, leave those down in the comment section. I'd be happy to answer them for you. Until next time, see ya.